welcome to the last episode of the first season of CoronaNomics What Just Happened, brought to you by Econ Films, where we go through the biggest events of yet another historic week with you, our live audience. So get involved on Twitter using hashtag CoronaNomics or on YouTube in the comments section. I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
Now, your usual presenter, Ben Chu, just couldn't bear the thought of saying goodbye in person. Instead chose to sit in traffic some dozen miles short of Penzance. So instead you've got me. I'm a senior fellow my name's Giles Wilkes, senior fellow at the Institute for Government, business advisor at Think Global, and an unapologetic former special advisor to both Vince Cable and Theresa May. So, Lizzie, how are things looking this week?
Well, it's been another busy week of coronavirus-related news. We had a history lesson from Donald Trump.
In 1917, they say, right? The great pandemic certainly was a terrible thing where they lost anywhere from 50 to 100 million people. Probably ended the Second World War. All the soldiers were sick.
Not quite how most people remember it. The author Toby Young set up the Love in a COVID Climate dating forum on his Lockdown Skeptics website. One lonely lockdowner said he was looking for an Albion-loving lady, 35 to 50, who would be open to dressing up as Winston Churchill and spanking me with a cricket bat. The sensible among us wondered whether he'd end up being a bit more than lovesick.
And Vladimir Putin has said that a locally developed vaccine for COVID-19 has been given the green light in Russia and even had it tested on one of his daughters. But the children of a country's ruler can scarcely be said to constitute a large enough sample size for medical research, or could they? Anyway, this week we're delighted to welcome Claire Jones, global economy reporter at FT Alphaville, who joins us from Germany. Hi, Claire. And we're also joined by Viraj Patel, FX and Global Macro Strategist at Arkera. He runs the morning macro call every day at 9:30 London time for financial market professionals. Welcome to you both.
Well, in our highly unscientific poll last week, Kamala Harris won a landslide victory as your pick to be Joe Biden's running mate. Joe must be a fan of CoronaNomics. So don't forget to vote in this week's poll. We're asking you to vote for how many times you've eaten out to help out this week. Was it A, once, B, twice, C, I don't eat in anymore, or D, never, I don't want COVID? We'll reveal the answer at the end of the show. And don't forget, if you've got a question, ask away on the YouTube comments or on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV. Now, Claire, what was your moment of the week?
It was the news that in the UK, the economy contracted by a fifth. GDP fell by 20%. That's the most since the current data series began. It's the sort of contraction that you just would not expect during peacetime, to go back to the war analogy used by Donald Trump, but hopefully a more accurate one. It's just the last time you've seen figures like this was during the Second World War, really. The UK's contraction was to be as expected in the sense that we've locked down the economy. You were going to see an awfully big contraction in the economy as the result of that. However, it was worse in the UK than it was in other economies in Europe, such as Germany's. There's a few reasons for that, I think. Do you think people would be interested in them or not?
Well, I would certainly be really interested in them. Claire, German envy has been a constant feature of my economic advising life. You look across the channel slightly north at the Germans and think they do everything better than us. In fact, I thank God every day that they don't play cricket. So how do they spitefully manage to keep COVID under better control than the English? And is that the reason they're also beating us economically as well, as someone who lives there?
They're not fans of cricket, unfortunately. There are a few reasons why. It's not all the kind of the fault of the UK and UK government policy and UK economic policy. I think that's worth bearing in mind. The German economy contracted by 10% as well, which is still an awful lot. And part of the reason why it contracted less than the UK economy in the second quarter was that it began its lockdown earlier. So by the
Right.
time we get to May in Germany, some of the factories are reopening. So that makes a difference to the Q2 number. You'd also expect it to be worse in the UK because we've got a bigger services sector, and manufacturing is a much bigger driver of growth in Germany. And the contraction in manufacturing output just wasn't as big as it was in services. If you shut shops, if you shut bars, you are going to see an awfully big contraction, and that makes up more of the economic makeup of the UK than it does in Germany. So there's those two reasons. Where I would say flawed government policy has had an impact on the economic figures is that Germany began its lockdown where cases were more under control, and that enabled it to have a shorter lockdown and a less strict lockdown too. And the result of that was that the hit to growth was not as bad. Now, I think the big picture for all of these economies really is not what the second quarter figures are. The big picture is where we're going to be in the medium term when we come out of this, when we start to reopen our economies. And there are some reasons for hope here in terms of the UK data. In June, when things did reopen a little bit, you did see better figures for the economy. And I also think the fact that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has been quite aggressive in terms of the furlough scheme and saying we'll cover 80% of people's wages who can't work at the moment. I think that's going to lead to a relatively strong rebound. So there's reasons, if not to be cheerful, to be cautiously optimistic that the UK won't be well that we will see things pick up.
Viraj, I want to put it to you that Jim O'Neill, who was a former guest on CoronaNomics, he had this article this week, we're talking about lockdowns, and he said that South Korea and many other nations haven't gone through full nationwide lockdowns, and this is almost definitely why their GDP loss has been much more modest. That's a fair point, isn't it?
I think so. I think Claire makes a good point about the sort of timing of the lockdown and how this is fed through into the UK GDP data. For me, the focus was really on the June figures. I think they surprised a bit to the upside and probably tell us more about the composition of growth in the UK going forward, the key drivers being manufacturing and construction activity, and probably confirms what we all expect, that the industrial sectors of the economy are probably going to bounce back a bit quicker, as it's relatively easier from a work perspective to return to normal here, whilst the services sector, in particular social consumption, will probably take a bit longer to contribute to GDP activity. But I do want to make one point. I think it really doesn't matter, I guess, for the real economy or financial markets what the data shows. And I think what really matters is how policy makers react to the data points and the likely policy actions they'll take in response. So, my job really at the moment is really trying to understand policymakers' reaction function and listening to what they are saying and doing versus really looking at backward data points, just because the state of the economy is moving so quickly that these data points are becoming quite old quite soon.
Right, so now we have a question from one of our CoronaNomics viewers sent in to us. It's Liz from London. Here's the question.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Liz Bailey, and I have been shielding since the 15th of March, so I wanted to ask the panel if the panel members had an underlying condition or vulnerability and had been told to shield since mid-March. Given the current numbers in England, the lack of proper test and trace system, instigation of local lockdowns all over the country, rumours of plans to reinstate shielding, and general lack of confidence in the government, would the panel members feel safe following government policy which says we're able to stop shielding now?
I mean, Giles, you've been a government advisor and your job was to try and please all the people all the time. What would you do if it was up to you?
You can work out how successful I was at that from the Lib Dem polling ratings when I left. But seriously, I mean, Liz asks a really tough question, which ultimately you can't answer anyway, but in a very personal way. I mean, she's right about the government failings, but it's also right that objectively, a lot of things have improved since the very worst days and when the advice was very strong that people should shield and stay away from everybody they possibly could. The rate of infection is a long way down, and the learning about the way to treat the infection afterwards has improved a lot. The fatality rates seem to be a bit lower. So all of those are what underpin the government's advice that it is safer to go out. But, you know, who can say that a 1 in 100 chance is unacceptable, but a 1 in 1,000 chance isn't? It's a very much a personal response. I mean, if any of the other panel members have a view, I'd be keen to hear it. But it's just a really difficult personal decision because you're taking risk with a really horrible disease.
Anyone else?
I guess that in one sense it's a personal question, but the tricky task of government is it does have to design policies based on these risks. I think the school reopening potentially in September is an example of that, where you could say it's in the interest of most that the schools do reopen. A lot of children are losing out. It's probably exacerbating inequality and social tensions that you are keeping the schools closed, because for the poorest children, the impact on their education is the worst. But at the same time, if you do reopen the schools, there probably are going to be some people who catch COVID, and there might be some people who end up seriously ill with that. But where do you kind of do the trade-off? Where do you do? I'd be interested to know your view on that, actually, Jazz, about how you kind of like you do the maths and you calculate, you know, it.
I mean, I never had to.
Course of action to take.
I will gracefully pass over, because I used to make judgments about whether we want to set up an aerospace technology institute or undermine the Chancellor's latest daft tax cutting plans. Nothing ever this serious. So you just can't make it, this sort of judgment centrally. You give people information and then leave it with them, I think, is the answer.
Have you got a strong view on this, Viraj?
Not really. I think it is quite personal. I think it's what's really interesting, and I think it's obvious when you look at the cross-country data, there isn't really a clear transmission mechanism between the number of COVID cases or even deaths and the way that consumers and businesses are acting. I think a lot of countries, even where cases have been lower, there's still apprehension in consumption. We're still seeing lower levels of activity and spending. So I think this idea that higher cases, higher sort of deaths and feeding through into sort of the economic activity, it's just untested. There's no economic textbook that tells you about this. And I think the data as they come along will tell us more, but there's no real sort of statistical evidence to prove one way or the other. I think it's just at the moment we're learning how consumers and businesses are dealing with what is an unprecedented environment.
Now, you'll all be very excited to hear that it's time for Guess the Graph. Since this is a chart showing a dramatic peak around the beginning of lockdown, I'm putting my money on this being something to do with people trying to bake sourdough or play Monopoly. We'll tell you what the answer is at the end of the show, what this graph represents. But any guesses, Claire, what this graph is?
Oh God, I'm not sure. Jigsaw consumption, judging by my family's lockdown habits, something like that.
What do you reckon, Viraj?
I thought it looked like initial jobless claims. I could be wrong.
Well, that's. I wish we could stay on the edge of my seat. But Viraj, in the meantime, what's your moment of the week then?
So my moment of the week was the Turkish Lira moving to a record low. And I chose this as my moment of the week for two reasons. Less so the FX policy mismanagement in Turkey itself, but more the broader implications it could have for the global economic recovery in the post-pandemic world. And I think the first point to make here is what you're seeing is in Turkey is not necessarily unique to the country. I think it's more a general policy dilemma that emerging market countries face whilst grappling with the health crisis and an economic lockdown. And I think a lot of countries are also facing now with a higher imported inflation, especially for food items, given their weaker currencies and the transmission of this into sort of imported costs. So this puts the central bank and officials and government authorities in a really tricky situation in emerging markets when it comes to adding policy stimulus, as there's always the fear of out of control budget deficits or runaway inflation if they ease too much. So right now, policy credibility in the EM space, at least from the eyes of investors, requires steady and controlled stimulus, which is at odds with what the support needed by businesses and consumers on the ground. And I think it's, like I said, it's not just Turkey. I think you can put Brazil, Mexico, India, South Africa, just a few that are also walking this really tricky policy tightrope. And I think the only thing that's worth mentioning in Turkey, I guess, it's a reminder to the EM world that bad policies will be punished by foreign investors. So something to watch out for. And I guess the second point, really, that we are stone throws away from an FX and tech crisis in Turkey, similar to what we saw in August 2018. I think really the key implications are for Turkey's trade and regional partners, namely the Eurozone and its recovery story. You've got two channels here, trade and financial contagion. European banks, for example, are still very exposed to Turkey, especially corporate, and any corporate sovereign defaults, for example, as a result of a weaker FX, could quite hinder the European recovery story. So for me, like we're looking at FX markets, I think that could be quite a big dent in the euro, which has front-run this recovery narrative in the European economy on the back of fiscal integration. So I think those are sort of the wider implications of Turkey and its sort of FX policies on the global economy.
Well, as luck would have it, I believe we've got a question from one of our viewers. Piril has got a question about, she's from Turkey, so let's hear from her and see whether you've answered some of it.
CoronaNomics, this is Piril from Turkey. Thanks for having me. The coronavirus pandemic has devastated the entire world and it has certainly been devastating for the Turkish economy. However, poor monetary policies unfortunately precede the pandemic. The inflation rate here has reached double digits at around 12%, and youth unemployment is at a record high. So my question to CoronaNomics is, what signals or what type of measures would foreign investors expect to see from the Central Bank of Turkey to restore trust in the economy? And is simply raising interest rates enough at this point? Also, what do you think will be the spillover effects of this crisis to emerging market economies and debtor countries within the Eurozone? Thank you.
Wow, so I mean, there's an awful lot there, and I think Viraj has answered a fair amount of it. So I'm going to put Claire on the hot spot. I mean, when every one of your variables is going wrong, unemployment, interest rates, inflation, you're in this terrible dilemma. In fact, I'm reminded of the situation we were in as the UK in 1976. Here's my bedtime reading. I'd love to ask Claire, what is your advice when everything's going wrong like that? And I'd love to know whether you think it might ever happen to Blighty again.
Oh God! Well, I think we're some way to go. I think what the issue is in Turkey, it's not only about the policy levers, it's about credibility too, and this issue where we all know Erdogan's views on interest rates. I think he called them the mother of all evils. So I think there's an issue in Turkey in the sense that people don't think it's going to act, and that's feeding through into this sentiment of things just looking bad on every level, like you say. In terms of the contagion impact back in 2018, this was a risk for the Eurozone banks. So I was writing about the European Central Bank then that was supervising the banks. And they were concerned enough to go around and start asking some of the banks that had exposures to Turkey how they were managing them. I don't know what the scenario this time around is, if it's got a little better in the intervening 2 years, but it certainly is a risk that we could see the European banks hit yet again. So it's not good from that perspective for the Eurozone either.
Well, we've got a question now from another audience member. It's someone in Penzance.
Hello, Lizzie, and hello, Giles. And well done, Giles. You're doing so much better than that other guy they had presenting this show. But my question is for you, Giles. We first met around 10 years ago online. You'd written something pretty outrageous on your blog, The Free Thinking Economist, and I'd taken exception and let you know. So my question is, can you remember what it was?
My shame is not feigned. I can tell you this. I remember it very clearly. I even remember the room I was sitting in when I saw devastatingly that Ben Chu of The Independent had put a comment on my blog about how hurt they were about me being slightly rude about The Independent and how they quite liked my blog. And I felt I shriveled up inside and was absolutely miserable about it. And I think I still haven't properly apologised to Ben. So it's good of him to engineer this moment and this whole TV experience just in order to see me abase myself and say The Independent is a great newspaper. It's particularly great because Ben's there, and I was wrong. It's provided some fantastic content over this time, and I hope I made up for it. I think I probably did so in the comment section right there, so this is a bit mean, I reckon.
I'm sure Lord Lebedev will be very happy with that.
Glad to hear.
Well, what's your moment of the week, Giles?
Well, apart from that was my moment. Okay, my moment of the week is about the latest twists and turns in the UK-Japan trade deal, which, as most people will know, is an attempt to replace the relations we've currently got via the EU with Japan, which is quite an important economy for us. We import and export about 14 billion pounds. However, the first point I would make is what I've learned from the whole Brexit saga is that in most trade deals don't really matter much. They're pretty small, and they're certainly not compared to having a close relationship with an economic behemoth right over there across the channel. So having an independent trade policy, in fact, isn't as much fun as it looks and opens you up to all sorts of difficult political disputes. And when you come to the benefits, you often have to introduce whole new decimal places. There's tiny amounts of it. But in any case, forgetting all that, the government has done a really good job recently in trying to keep this Japanese trade deal on track. It's better not to have yet another arrangement ripped up, as it were, as we leave the customs union and single market next year. But unfortunately, it seemed this week that Liz Truss, the Secretary of State at the Department of Trade, wants to summon up the spirit of 2014 and make it all about cheese.
We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
Now, I find this a bit odd. I mean, Liz Truss, I know from my time in government, is a really interesting minister, a proper intellectual, but why would she want to be remembered for this moment in 2014 when, as Secretary of State for Agriculture, she seemed to go slightly loopy and want to jump into the crowd, the Tory conference, and punch anyone who suggests buying Camembert or Brie instead of good English cheddar? I don't understand why she wants to summon this up, because she's now mocked about it. And the week's news reminds us of quite how small some of these agricultural markets are. We export apparently £102,000 worth of cheese to Japan every year, which is less than the salary of a cabinet minister. So you could save that much by getting rid of one member of the cabinet. And we won't do a poll on which one you think. So that's my moment of the week. Important trade deals being taken to pieces by small cheese matters.
Viraj, is Giles right?
I think it's just an interesting sort of tactic probably from the UK government right now. I think the best thing I saw on Twitter was someone commenting that this trade deal stinks. That was probably the best comment. I think, look, when it comes to Brexit and sort of we've been to this party, I think a lot of market participants are sort of moving on and trying to look at the end game. And I think there really isn't sort of anything to make of these sort of day-to-day negotiations right now. I think unless the UK government stance has changed. I think really the best way that I phrased it is that it's kind of like these risks of no deal, or like the boy who cried wolf. I think right now we're just waiting for, we've heard it so many times now in the market side, and I think no one's really paying much attention, pricing in any expectations. And, there's always the risk that come December, that could easily bite sterling markets. And I think that's probably the way that things will go in terms of expectations between the now and the year end.
Claire, when it comes to the Japan deal, is it all just a bit of political theatre?
Yeah, and I think it's actually quite effective political theatre. I mean, to emphasise Giles's point, the economic benefits of these single trade deals are rather small in terms of the impact on GDP, in terms of the flows of imports and exports. I'd say that from an economic confidence perspective, it is quite good news. I think there was a fear that the UK even lacked the expertise to do these sorts of trade deals, that we'd hived out the expertise to the EU. And if we do manage to get this trade deal through, then I think it will give us some confidence, which is helpful. That's a useful boost. And in terms of political theatre, I think it's quite handy. And we were talking about Stilton cheese right now, which I don't think we otherwise would have been. So if she can stick up for the cheese makers and then kind of seal the deal by the end of August, I think it's quite effective from a political point of view, yeah.
I think it represents something like 0.007. I might have missed a naught in there.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
our
I read that
total
as well.
UK exports. So, yeah, Stilton's really punching above its weight there, driven a wedge and things. Well, it's time to reveal the answer to our Guess the Graph, which we have here. If you remember, Claire thought it was jigsaw puzzle buying. I think Viraj might have been close, a bit warmer. Last chance for a guess, Giles?
I was going to stick with Monopoly because I know that everyone was playing it in April and then everyone started fighting. And they don't play it at Christmas. But no, I suspect I'm wrong.
No, it's the weekly applications for universal credit, unfortunately. So there was a spike and we've seen it petering down. But it brings me on to my moment of the week because Claire talked about the GDP data, but I want to talk about the jobs data that also came out this week. And you might think they're very similar, but actually, of course, the size of the economy and how people are working should be closely related, but they haven't been recently. And it's only when we get the November figures in December, which will account for a full month after the furlough scheme's been totally phased out, if it hasn't been extended by then. That's when we'll know the true impact of the shutdown on the labour market. But for now, the official unemployment rate hasn't risen from 3.9% because to be included in that number, counted in the unemployed, workers need to be actively looking for a new job. And many people haven't been recently because they've been furloughed in the millions. But economists have said that the worst is yet to come. The number of hours worked per week did fall 18% since March. And unofficial indicators have shown that people are increasingly worried about their job security. Searches on Google have gone up for phrases like redundancy. So Viraj, I wanted to ask you, we've been having the debate about the benefits of the furlough scheme for months now, but now that we've actually got some data, do you think that the furlough scheme should be extended?
I think it's a tricky question because I think that obviously on the one hand, what you might effectively do by sort of just rolling on the furlough scheme for 1 or 2 months is delaying the inevitable. I think what's probably the better way of going about it from the government's perspective is really trying to find out the true underlying unemployment, the structural unemployment. How many of these jobs are really going to come back online and how many of them are probably at risk? And I think if they can try to solve that and try to get some more data and understanding over that side of things and then find solutions for the jobs at risk, I think that's probably the better strategy than just kicking through the furlough scheme in its current form, because it just, like I said, could just delay the sort of push, the sort of kick the can down the road to some extent. So yeah, it's a really tricky situation because no one really knows what the underlying structural unemployment rate in the UK economy will be come November time, December time. I think even the Bank of England is sort of grappling with that in terms of knowing that there could be a big uncertainty in that number. And I think the real, from a government perspective, is really to try and find out which sectors, which jobs are most at risk, and trying to provide support to those versus just a generic furlough scheme.
Claire, Giles was talking earlier about how British policymakers have often been jealous of German ones, and I think one thing that in Britain people were wishing they had at the start of the crisis was the short-time work scheme. I wonder what the British response is perceived over in Germany, and if you think it was the best one.
I mean, I think you've got to credit both governments, actually. I think both Berlin and London were very quick in saying we need substantial support for people's jobs. I think that was totally right. You've got a social contract here. You're asking to, basically you're taking away an awful lot of people's freedom under lockdown. You're saying you have to abide by these rules. You can't go shopping. You can't visit some of your family. You can't visit your friends, all sorts of barriers on people's lives. And the quid pro quo for that, I think, is that if it does affect their livelihoods, that the state pays for that. I think Berlin got that, and I think Rishi Sunak got that very quickly as well. Now, in terms of the mechanics, I think the Kurzarbeit in Germany is 70% of wages, similar in the UK to what we've got in terms of 80%. But I agree going forward that, for obvious reasons, there wasn't a lot of time. This was a pretty blunt tool when it was brought in, but now you need a more nuanced taper coming out. I don't think you can have some cliff edge in October where you get rid of it for all sectors and all employees.
Got it. And on the subject of the state paying for things, we've got the answers to our poll about how often have you been eating out and dining out on Rishi Sunak, and it's fairly unequivocal. We got about 10% have gone out once, 21% twice, 5% don't eat in anymore, but 63% of the fans of this programme don't want to. They don't want to catch COVID. So that's what I find interesting is within the Treasury, they're very pleased with this scheme, and it's quite novel for them to do something, not just the sort of gimmickiness about it and having the Chancellor's face on food saying I paid for this, which I don't remember Margaret Thatcher doing except when she took the milk away. But they're looking for more ideas like this. They would really like to have more demand side ideas, because the Treasury normally hates people doing things on the demand side. So I would like to encourage the Treasury to carry on. They're going to get a lot of mockery, but so I'd like to know, Claire, what do you think of it? Is it a reasonably good idea, eat out to help out?
I've got quite mixed views on it, actually. I can see how it helps one of the hardest hit sectors of the economy for sure. But yeah, I do have my concerns. If it seems like cases are pretty much, they're quite under control at the moment in most parts of the country. So you can say, okay, this is a good way to get economic activity back up. But yeah, I do have my concerns personally over how wise a move it's going to be. Kind of packed restaurants, people indoors, when we know indoors, in confined spaces is not, the best way to avoid COVID-19.
Yeah, Viraj, do you agree? Is this not exactly a healthy policy? What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think from personal experience, I haven't sort of used the scheme, partly because I had far too many deliveries between March and July. So I think my diet's come from the completely other way, and I'm trying to be a bit more healthy. But I've been going to the gym actually recently, and you can see that there's a tenth of the sort of numbers of people in there. Partly again the concerns, partly also probably the lack of awareness. But even though a lot of people have taken social distancing and cleanliness into their own hands, and it's been well kept from my personal experience. And I think the tricky bit here is now, how do you get back to some sort of normal level of social consumption whilst also having this fear in the back of your mind? And I think, whilst the weather's good, maybe making use of open spaces, maybe 50% off open exercise regimes in the park or something like that, and fitness training, that could sort of, from a mental perspective as well as a health perspective, be much more valuable to people, and sort of then also lead to animal spirits in terms of spending and returning back to normal, than just adding the idea of just trying to get people into packed restaurants, as Claire sort of highlighted.
Well, thank you to you both. That's it for season 1 of CoronaNomics. Thank you so much to our audience for all your support, engagement, and your questions. And of course, to all our wonderful guests who've made it possible. We'll be back in September with our new run.
And can I give my thanks especially to Viraj and Claire for joining us today, and to you all for watching and sending in questions. Please do keep them coming for future weeks, and we welcome suggestions on what else we might cover.
The other people I want to thank are the people behind the scenes at Econ Films who've made all of this possible. They're a great team. And thanks. Don't forget to catch our latest episode with Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization, on who should be the next Director General of the WTO, Brexit, and how the COVID trade crisis can be resolved. And please do follow us on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV for all our latest episodes.
As a big as a big fan of the show, I can't wait to hear what happens in season 2. We seem to have ended on a real cliffhanger. Will the furlough scheme come back? And that was a long pause. I'm sorry. You can tell when you've got an amateur new presenter in. But now it's time for our outro, which is traditionally played by our former CoronaNomics live guest and big Jethro Tull fan, Stuart Wood, which next season Viraj has promised to remix for us. Take it away, Lord Wood.